Awesome. Man, I love our church. Do you guys love our church? Like you guys are incredible. I hope you know that, seriously. Well, good morning. My name is Bridget Harris. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the youth pastor here. I say this pretty much every time on stage that I have an absolute blast hanging out with all of your guys' kids, and I mean that every time I say it. I'm convinced that I have the coolest job in the world. I'm sorry, Eric, Carrie, Jeff, I'm convinced that I have the best job in the entire world because I get to spend so much time with your kids and just hang out with them, and it's so much fun. So we get to do ice cream, we get to do movies, I go to their musicals, their plays, football games. It is seriously so much fun. And I've made it a priority to try to meet kids where they're at. Recently, though, that's backfired on me just a little bit, because now some of my youth students have tried to invite me to hang out with them in some other ways. And one of the most recent ways has been inviting me to go to the gym with them. And that is not typically my forte, okay? Like I said, ice cream, you can invite me for ice cream all day long. But inviting me to the gym, they're like, hey, what are you doing at 6 o'clock in the morning? And I was like, I'm gonna be in bed. What are you doing at 6 o'clock in the morning? Or the past couple of weeks, I've had kids invite me. They're like, hey, we're going to the gym at 11 o'clock tonight. Are you available tonight at 11 to go? I was like, I don't know, guys. I have a pretty strict bedtime. And so these past couple of weeks, though, they've been really wearing me down. They're like, no, you should do it. And I was like, okay. So I finally committed. I went to the gym with them. I've been being pretty intentional about trying to go with them these past couple of weeks, or be intentional about working out at home. But some of my hesitation about going to the gym is that I knew it couldn't just be a one-time hangout, right? I knew I could get ice cream one time, but if you're gonna commit to going to the gym, you have to really commit to going to the gym. You have to be consistent with it. And so I've been trying to be consistent with it. I've been following one of my friends on Facebook. He's a trainer, and he made this post the other day that was actually really inspiring to me. So like I said, he's a trainer. It's what he does for his living, is to train people on how to work out, how to be healthy, how to be sustainable. And so recently, just a couple of months ago, he had to have a surgery on his lower spine, and he was in recovery for a really long time, and it set him back a significant amount because he wasn't able to go to the gym, he wasn't able to work out, he wasn't able to be consistent. And so this is the part of the post that inspired me, though. He was posting about his fitness journey, his recovery journey, and he said this: what if the greatest story that you could ever tell was about the comeback and not the setback? What if the greatest story that you could ever tell was about the comeback and not the setback? And that really resonated with me, because I feel like sometimes it's so easy to focus on everything that's maybe going wrong in our life, the things that we're unhappy with, the things that we're struggling with, the areas of difficulty in our life, instead of focusing on everything that God's trying to do, everything that He has done. And so that's what we're going to focus in on and key in on today. Last week, Pastor Bobby did a phenomenal job talking about Genesis chapter 40, walking through the story of Joseph and how he ended up wrongly in prison, that he was unjustly thrown into prison for a false accusation. And so the last verse in chapter 40 was him basically pleading to this cupbearer that he interpreted dreams for. He said, hey, when you get released, when you get out of this prison, like I've said that you will, like God says that you will you just remember me? Will you remember me, and will you get me out of this prison too? So that's where we left off last week. And this week we're picking up in chapter 41 of Genesis. And it says, in that last verse, it said, yet the cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So today we're picking up in chapter 41, verses 1 through 9. And it says this: when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. So again, this is 2 years past when the original cupbearer had been released from prison. So Pharaoh's the ruler. He's the person that's in charge at that period of time. So this is the ruler of Egypt, and he's having these dreams that he can't quite understand. So he woke up. Said he fell back asleep again, and he had a second dream, that there were 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. And then after them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. Now, if I was Pharaoh at this point, I would have been like, what did I eat the night before, right? Like, this can't just be me. Like, have you ever had those dreams, like, when you wake up in the morning and you're like, oh man, I had that spicy food, like, I ate that too late last night. Like, I had too much queso last night, and I'm just having some weird dreams. Like, that can't just be me, right? So Pharaoh, though, he was like, no, he felt a stirring in his spirit, and he's like, this isn't just something that I ate, this isn't just a weird dream, because sometimes you can throw it off like, oh man, that was weird. But he felt something in his spirit. It said his mind was troubled. So he went to the magicians and the wise men of Egypt, saying, hey, I'm going to tell you my dreams. I need you to interpret them for me, because there's something about this. There's something in this dream that's trying to speak to me. But it said that he went to all of these people, and nobody could interpret them for him. So then the chief cupbearer to Pharaoh, he's one of his attendants, he remembered, he said, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. So 2 years later, the cupbearer remembered, oh man, wait, there was this guy that I was in prison with who could interpret dreams, and it suddenly just clicked for him. And so the cupbearer told Pharaoh, hey, I know you've kind of exhausted all of your resources. I know that you've tried all of your magicians. I know that you've tried all of your wise men. Like, this guy, he's like a lowly, Hebrew servant. He's in prison. I don't know if he's going to be able to do anything for you. But I remember he interpreted my dreams, and what he said, it came true. So maybe you should check this guy out. So Pharaoh, hearing this, in verse 14, it says, Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon, from prison. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before the Pharaoh, before the ruler. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. So Pharaoh had heard from the cupbearer that Joseph could interpret it. I want to pause for a second here. Kind of what I had mentioned earlier. 2 years had gone by since Joseph had last interpreted that dream for the cupbearer. I don't know about you guys, but a lot can happen in a 2-year span. You can feel a lot of things, you can question a lot of things, you can doubt a lot of things. Bob even talked about last week how when he was given a dream as a young child and it wasn't coming true, that maybe he would begin to doubt that, but he still stepped out in faith and interpreted those dreams anyway. So now another 2 years had gone by, and he's faced once again with whether or not he can trust God and trust his abilities that he's been given. 2 years of doubt, of being left alone. And it's easy for us to read the story and to be inspired by Joseph, right? Because if we don't know the story, we just flip ahead a few chapters, we see the ending, we see how things turn out, how great it is. But for Joseph in this moment, this was real for him. He was in prison, he was alone, he was rejected, he was doubting, he was afraid, he was frustrated, he was defeated. And so I want you to kind of picture yourself and put yourself in Joseph's shoes for a minute. If you were in prison for 2 years, the last thing that you say to this person, please don't forget me, and then you're forgotten, and then being called out of the dungeon and all of the feelings that you might have as you're coming out of this. And so for us, I know that we've had our prison moments, right? And how much harder is it for us to live in those moments when we don't know the end of the story? And I think it's a little bit ironic even that Joseph knew the fate of the cupbearer and of the other attendant of Pharaoh, but he didn't know his own fate, right? And so there may be situations in our life when we see the ending for somebody else or we see the end of somebody else's story, but we're still in the middle of ours. And so we have to wrestle with that tension of living in the now. And so that's where Joseph is at this point. He doesn't know if or when he's going to get out of prison. He's been physically and mentally and spiritually challenged. He feels alone. He feels forgotten. He feels rejected. He feels like he's at the complete opposite side of the dream that God has given him. And so I'm sure like you guys, I found myself in that situation before where I felt that, alone, rejected, defeated, saying, God, you gave me this dream, what now? But I believe that Joseph was able to persevere because of this one simple truth, and it's back a couple chapters in Genesis 39:21, says, but the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. And I think Joseph knew that. Joseph was able to cling to that, and he knew that God was with him. But here's the thing, walking with God, like Joseph was, it doesn't mean that we won't encounter hard things, right? So Joseph still encountered difficulty, even though he was walking with God. He still ended up in prison. He still ended up feeling frustrated. He still ended up feeling alone and rejected. He still had to go through a lot of trials before he ever reached the dream. And so know that God is with you, but also know that you will encounter hard things, and that's okay, and that's okay. But in Romans 8:28, we are promised that despite the hard things that we will face, that God is going to turn everything for good. He's going to use it all for good. And I think that that's important for us to remember as well. Because when you have the perspective that God is with us, and when you have the perspective that God uses everything for good, then our perspective can really begin to shift, right? Because then we don't just see the setback, we see the comeback. We don't just see the situation that we're living in, but we see the hope for the future that God's providing for us. And I think the real test here wasn't whether or not Joseph could just endure his circumstances. It wasn't just a question of his willpower, how much longer he could stick it out, how much longer he could take the frustration, the hurt, the defeat, everything that he was feeling. I think the real test was actually whether or not he trusted God. It was actually whether or not he trusted God. It was whether or not he had a close, intimate relationship with God. And that was the thing that actually ended up pulling him through the prison. And I think for us, if we're honest, that's a hard question to ask ourselves if we really trust God. And somebody may come up to you and they may say, hey, do you trust God? And you're like, off the top of your head, you're like, yeah, no, I do. But in the moment when you're feeling defeated and rejected and alone, that question gets a little bit harder. God, do I really trust you? Do I really trust your character? Do I really trust that what you say is good for me? Do I trust your process? I feel like I've been in a season of that lately where I'm having to trust God with a lot of things that are hard. It's hard to fully trust your life to somebody, right? To say, hey, God, I give you everything. I give you everything. But I found comfort in the fact, and I think Joseph perhaps found comfort in the fact that it was never really our life to begin with, right? That he created us. And so because of that, it's our life to give back to him. And when we turned away from him, God redeemed us. And we can trust him because he's proven that we can time and time again. So I imagine these 2 years that Joseph is in prison, he probably had some similar talks with God. He probably spent a lot of time with Jesus because in prison, there's not a whole lot you can do. And the things that he was doing, it's probably forced labor. And he was probably just spending a lot of time praying to God, asking for help, voicing his frustration. So I imagine it went a little like this. God, I feel really alone right now. I don't have my family. The people that were in the prison with me are gone. They were either killed or they're elevated back to their position. God, I feel so alone. But God, I trust that you're with me. God, it feels like my life is falling apart right now. It feels like I'm so far from that dream that you've given me. I don't know how I ended up in this situation. I did everything right. God, I did everything right. I don't understand. But I trust that you're with me. God, I don't understand why this is happening to me. God, I don't see how this can be a part of your plan. I don't see how it fits into the picture. This doesn't make sense to me. But God, I trust that you're with me. God, I don't see how any good can come out of this situation. I mean, I'm in prison. I was in human trafficking. My family has rejected me and abandoned me. My father doesn't know that I'm alive or not. God, I don't see the good in this. Where's the good in this? I'm in prison right now. I may never leave this prison. But God, I trust that you're good, and I trust that your plan for me is also good. So I imagine that there was this wrestling between Joseph, his flesh and his spirit. God, this is what I feel, but this is what I know. God, this is what I feel, but this is what your truth says. God, this is what I feel, but I'm trusting you. And I think we have that same choice. Proverbs 3:5 says, trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Isaiah 55:8-9 continues, the Lord declares, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways. And the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. So in the same way, we're encountered with that same circumstance, where things may not make sense in our life, where we're a little bit frustrated, where we're confused, where we're defeated. And we have to have this war between our spirit and our flesh, between what we feel and what is the truth, between what we're facing currently and what God says is to come. And so these verses are saying, hey, don't rely on yourself. Don't rely on your own heart. Don't rely on things that logically make sense. Don't put God in a box because you have no clue what he's up to or what he's doing or the things that he's doing in the background. So there will be things that happen in our life that we can't understand. There'll be hurt that happens in our life that we can't understand. There'll be situations that happen to us that we have no control over, that we can't understand. There will be loss that we encounter that we don't understand. But the good news is that God does understand. He does understand what's happening. God knew exactly what he was doing in the story with Joseph and having him in prison. See, where Joseph saw a prison, God actually used that as a season of preparation for what was to come next for Joseph. And so just as a little side note here, I think sometimes there may be dreams that we are given, that God has placed in our hearts that are God-centered dreams. And he's saying, I gave you that dream, but you're not ready for it yet. You need to go through a season of preparation first, because if I gave that to you now, the dream wouldn't be fulfilled. You're not quite there yet. You're not quite ready for that yet. Sometimes God doesn't even need to do the work in you. Sometimes he needs to do the work in others, because we're about to read in just a little bit, God actually had to do some work in Pharaoh too before this could all come to pass. So maybe you're ready, but the people around you aren't ready for what's to come. So there are a lot of things that are in the background that God is moving in that we don't always see. So all times, God is doing work. So what ended up happening was God was preparing Joseph, and then God was preparing Pharaoh for what was about to happen. But entering back into the story, Joseph is called out of prison. So then Pharaoh asks, okay, so can you interpret my dreams that I've been given? Genesis 41:16, Joseph replies, I cannot do it. I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And that's a small verse, but it's a powerful verse, because there's already a shift that we begin to see in Joseph. And just these couple of years that he was in prison, these couple of years that he was in Egypt, there was a shift that happened in Joseph's spirit and his heart and what was happening in him. So as a teenager, Joseph was boasting about himself as his dreams, right? He was so excited to tell his brothers, hey, you're going to bow down to me one day. He was so excited to run to his parents and say, hey, you're also going to bow down to me one day. He was all about elevating himself, lifting himself up. He wanted the affirmation. He wanted the recognition. He wanted to be special. But in this moment, when he had the opportunity to do that and to say, yes, I can interpret your dreams. I can help you. I can do this for you. He instead put the glory back on where it belonged, and he praised God and said, it's not me that can do this. It's God that can do this. It's God who can interpret these dreams. Now, this is a really big deal, because at the time, Pharaoh, like I said, it was the ruler of Egypt. And at that period of time, the ruler of Egypt, Pharaoh, it wasn't just seen as like a king. It was literally, they viewed Pharaoh as their god, as a man-made god that they created for themselves. So they elevated Pharaoh to a god status. So for Joseph, he had to be pretty bold to look a man-made God in the face and challenge him with a different God, the one true God, and say, no, I know this is who you are, but actually there's somebody that's above you. There's the one true king that actually needs to be acknowledged here. So if Joseph really wanted to be elevated, if he wanted to be raised up in status, if he was trying to achieve his dreams on his own, right? He was like, God, you gave me this dream that people are going to bow down to me one day. If he wanted to take that into his own hands, it would have made more sense for Joseph to say, yes, I can interpret these dreams. I can do this. It would have been more wise to give himself the credit. But instead, that's not what he does. He looks to Pharaoh and says, I can't do this, but God can. So in those 2 years, I'm sure it felt like to Joseph that God wasn't really doing anything, that he was just sitting in prison, that he was getting no closer to his dream, that he was getting no closer to anything that God had in store for him, when in reality, those 2 years were the most important years. They were the formative years. There was the deep heart work years that God was trying to do in his life. And just in that one verse alone, we see that God was up to something. And there may be something in your life where it's like, God, I feel really far away. I feel really far away from you and from the dream that you've given me, but you don't see everything that God's doing. You don't see how he's shaping your character day by day, how he's molding your heart to look more like his in every single moment, saying, hey, I'm trying to align you closer to me. And the closer you get to me, the closer you're getting to the dream that I've given you. So that's what's happening for Joseph in these 2 years. He was talking with God daily. So now imagine what your life would look like if you choose to walk with God daily. Instead of turning your back on God during the hard circumstances, instead of being angry at him or confused, saying, God, I'm going to walk with you through this because I'm trusting that there is a purpose for this, and I'm trusting that you're going to bring me through it. So God, I'm going to walk with you. I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to deepen my relationship with you. Going back to the story, though, Joseph then goes on to correctly interpret Pharaoh's dreams. So in Genesis 41:28, it says, it is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. So he's talking about what's going to happen to the nation of Egypt. There's going to be 7 years of abundance, and there's going to be 7 years of complete famine in the land. So then Joseph goes on to say, this is what I think you should do. So now, Pharaoh, you're to look for a wise and discerning man to put him in charge of the land of Egypt. So just as Joseph went through a season of preparation, he's saying, hey, Pharaoh, now you need to go through a season of preparation. This nation needs to go through a season of preparation because there's about to be some hard times. We need to prepare for this. So Pharaoh hears this and he says, yeah, that's actually, that sounded correct. You did interpret my dreams correctly. This does make sense. I feel like this is from God. His spirit was at peace again because he knew that Joseph had interpreted it correctly. So he said, this seemed good. This plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one who is in the spirit of God? Remember, Pharaoh is elevated to the status of a god in the people's minds. So already, he's acknowledging and recognizing the power of the one true God, just in this one moment, by saying, can we find anyone who is in the spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made this all known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be put in charge of my palace, and all of my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So in one instant, in one brief conversation, everything changed for Joseph. He was in the prison, and suddenly he was elevated to this new status where everything shifted for him. So it continues in verse 41. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Everything. Of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger, the mark of what it meant to be royalty, essentially, and he put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen, and he put a gold chain around his neck. He made him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt. So Joseph just became second in command in Egypt, one of the most powerful countries at this point in time. Joseph was just elevated from prison, lowly Hebrew servant, to second in command of this whole country because he was faithful to God and he trusted in the plan that he had for him. So just moments before, I want you to catch this because this so often will happen in our lives too. Moments before, he wore the shackles of a prisoner. Now he wore the ring of Pharaoh. Moments before, he was in the rags of what he'd been wearing in the dungeon. Now he was clothed in the fine linen that Pharaoh gave him. Moments before, he walked as a slave. Now he was riding second in command as a chariot. Moments before, Joseph could only obey orders. Now he was the one giving the orders. Moments before, Joseph was in a prison, but now he enjoyed the life of the palace. So in one instant, Joseph went from prison to palace. And I believe that Joseph needed to fully understand what it was like to live in the prison to better understand the palace. Because everything is so much sweeter, and I'm sure you guys know it, when you go through that struggle, when you go through that hardship, and you finally come through, you finally make it to the end, and everything just seems better, right? Or let's say you're running a race, and you push through, and you finish the race, and you do it well, and you're exhausted, and that water at the end of the race, it's just so much sweeter because you know the work that it took to get there. And so Joseph, in this moment, he's experiencing that. I imagine he's looking back at everything that just happened to him, and everything clicked. God, I see what you're up to now. God, I get it now. I get it now. And you don't see it in the moment, but afterwards, you see in hindsight everything that God was up to. So he appreciated it so much more. As a teenager, Joseph thought that the palace was his right, that he was entitled to be there. Everybody's going to bow down to me. But after walking through this season, Joseph realized that everything that he had was a gift from God. Because what he realized is that this dream that he was given, he didn't earn it. He didn't elevate himself to the position where people were bowing down to him. It was simply by saying, God, I'm faithful. God, I'm here. God, I'm available. God, I'm walking with you. Everything that he had, he acknowledged, God, it's because of you. He didn't earn his way into the palace. And so the same thing is true for us. God has given us everything. And there may be situations where he's saying, you don't have to strive for that dream. You don't have to push for that dream. You just have to trust that I'm going to walk you through the season to get there. And I'm going to lead you to that palace place. Take it a step further and just think about for a moment how beautifully everything was orchestrated to make this moment happen. How each and every piece fits together, how each and every season had a purpose. Because what if for a moment we look back, what if instead of being forgotten for 2 years, the cupbearer mentioned Joseph right away? He said, "Hey, Pharaoh, I just got out of prison, and there's this guy that could interpret dreams." And Pharaoh's like, "Cool. Glad you got out of prison. Like, I'm glad you're back." But it took the 2 years because Pharaoh needed to have those dreams. God needed to do something in his spirit. Pharaoh needed to become desperate for answers, to find something outside of himself. And so if Pharaoh would have heard about Joseph any sooner, he may have been indifferent. It wouldn't have mattered. If Joseph was released sooner, he may have not been elevated to that position because at that time, his abilities weren't needed. So he may have never gotten to the place that God was trying to take him. So even in that moment where Joseph felt the most defeated, where he felt the most forgotten and rejected and alone, God's saying, "I have a plan. I have a plan, and you need to trust my timing." God waited for just the right time. Amen. And in our life, there are situations where God is waiting for just the right time. That we're pleading, we're saying, "God, take me out of this prison. Don't forget me. God, I feel rejected. I feel alone. I feel defeated. I feel far from your purpose. God, get me out of this prison." Saying, "I'm waiting for the right time. I'm waiting for the right time," because there's a season of preparation that needs to come first. So the waiting season looks different for all of us. For some of us, it revolves around our family. For some of us, it's our job. For some of us, it's our what we feel like our purpose or our career is supposed to be in life. For some of us, it's maybe a little bit deeper, and we're waiting for a season of deep healing, and we're waiting on that, whether that's physical healing or spiritual healing or mental healing. Maybe there's situations with our family that need some healing as well, and we're frustrated, and we're saying, "God, just get me out of here." He's saying, "I'm waiting for the right time. I'm waiting for the right time." So once again, the question becomes, like I'm sure Joseph was asked and wrestled with God, do you trust God? Do you trust his timing? Do you trust his process? Do you trust that what he has for you is good? Do you trust that he is good? Do you trust God? To the eyes of the people in that room with Pharaoh, as they're all sitting there with his officials and the other people that are in the court, it looked like Joseph was elevated in an instant. Right? Instantaneous, overnight, he just went from this lowly Hebrew slave to all of a sudden second in command. They didn't know his story. He was a nobody. They didn't care who he was. They didn't know who he was. But the truth is that it took 13 years from Joseph to go from the pit that he was thrown into as a teenager by his brothers to the palace that he was now living in. 13 years was he living in slavery, in prison, in a foreign land, rejected and alone. 13 years of hard circumstances, 13 years between the dream and where he was currently living, 13 years of trusting God over and over and over again every single day. And in our lives, we're going to experience that. We're going to experience the pits, we're going to experience the palace, the highs and the lows, probably more times than we can count in both ways. We're going to be in a lot of pits, and we're going to be in a lot of palaces. We're going to be in both of those seasons of development, because the truth is that Joseph was being developed in both seasons. He's being developed in the prison, and he was also being developed in the palace. But both seasons, what we learn from Joseph is that he leaned on God. When he was in the prison, he leaned on God. When he was elevated out of the prison, he leaned on God. He easily could have turned his back on God in the hard circumstances and been frustrated and offended and angry and bitter at God, but he leaned into him instead. And he just as easily could have forsaken God when he got out of the prison and said, "God, it wasn't you that brought me out of the prison. You forgot me. I did this because it's my ability. I was the one that could interpret the dreams." But he didn't do that either. He recognized that everything came from God, and he leaned on him and trusted him in all of the circumstances. So because of that, Pharaoh recognized this. He said, "The Spirit of God is in you. I don't even fully know who this is, but there's something different about you. The Spirit of God is in you." In Galatians 5:22-23, it talks about the fruit of the Spirit. It says, "But the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control." If I was Joseph in that prison situation, I would have a hard time cultivating these things. But he was, because he walked with God. And when you're close with God, these are the fruits that will follow that. So Pharaoh recognized that and said, there's something different about you. The Spirit of God is in you. Joseph could have been angry, but instead he pressed into the Spirit. So the question is, do people recognize the Spirit of God in you? When you're walking through your hard circumstances, when you're struggling, when you're in your prison moments, do people still recognize the Spirit of God in you and the work that he's doing? Are you pressing into him? Are you so close to him that whenever people are around you, they just know that something's different about you? Because the truth is, when God is doing work in us, it's never just for us. The preparation season that we're going through, it's never just for us. Pain will always have a purpose. And purpose is almost always connected to people. Almost always. So you may never know the reach that you'll have with people, the depth that you'll have with people, the impact that you'll have on the people that you're about to encounter. Joseph didn't know when he was in that prison, when he was forgotten by the cupbearer, he didn't know that 2 years later he'd be saving thousands of lives because of his work that he was about to do in storing up grain for the famine. He didn't know that he was about to save thousands and thousands of lives. So for you, a question to ask yourself is, as you're trying to wrestle through this, who will you impact by your faithfulness? Your school, your friends, your family, your coworkers, a stranger that you don't even know, but God is doing a work in you saying, I'm preparing you for something that you can't even dream of on your own. I'm getting you ready for that. So the story goes on to say that Joseph, during the 7 years of abundance, he collected all the food and he stored it away. And then during that time as well, Joseph also had 2 sons born to him. In verse 51, it says, Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, and he said, it is because God made me forget all of my trouble and all my father's household. God was helping him forget the pain of the past. And then the second son he named Ephraim, and he said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. So he acknowledged both truths. I was suffering, but God is still with me. I am in a time of difficulty, but God is still with me, and he's still working it for good. And then says in verse 53 that the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end. The 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. So there's a famine throughout the whole lands, and then everybody was going to Joseph. The Pharaoh said, hey, go to Joseph. I know you're hungry. I know you're looking for food. Go to Joseph. He has it all stored up. He has it ready for you. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. And the next few chapters, as we're about to read on next week, it describes how Joseph's dreams that he was given as a 17-year-old were finally fulfilled. The next chapters talk about that. But here's the thing, I think some of you may think that the sermon is simply about being faithful until we reach the palace. And that's easy to pull from that. But really what this story is about, it's about Joseph, a man who is faithful to God, not just when his dreams were realized, not just until the hard times were over, but he was faithful to God at all times. And that's what we're being asked to do, is being faithful to God always, to depend on God regardless of our circumstances, good or bad. In the hard moments, not to reject him. In the good moments, not to reject him, but in every moment to say, God, I need you. I depend on you. I trust you. More than anything, I trust you. So we're left with that same choice. Do I trust God? Do I lean on him in all times? Will I look at the goodness of God through the lens of my circumstances? Or will I look at my circumstances through the lens that God is good? And when you shift that, man, everything changes. Paul speaks of this in Philippians 4:11. Says, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or living in want. I can do all things through God who gives me strength. I can do all things through God who gives me strength. So Paul's saying, I've been at both ends. I've been in the pit, I've been in the palace, but I'm trusting God. It doesn't matter where I'm at because I'm with God, and that's the only thing that matters. In the good and the bad, God is with us. In the good and the bad, God has a plan for us. He has a plan for you. He wants to do something in your life. He wants what's best for you. but our best doesn't always look like God's best. We might have to walk through some prisons. We might have to sit in some pits for a little while. But God is doing a work in you. And God wants to use you to do a work in others. And so my simple encouragement for you this week is don't be discouraged when you're in a time that's difficult. When you feel alone, when you feel defeated, when you feel rejected, when you feel like God's not listening. Because it's usually in those moments that it's a signal that God's up to something big. He's saying, I'm just preparing you for something. Don't let go of the dreams that God gave you so long ago. Don't lose hope. Don't quit walking with God. So as you walk out these doors today, I just want you to ask yourself a simple question. God, where am I at with you right now? Do I trust you? Do I trust you? And if you do, keep walking with him. And if you don't, pray and ask God to begin to change your spirit. Bring your doubts to him. Bring your frustrations to him. Bring your concerns to him. Say, God, I don't trust you right now. He can take that. But God, I ask that you change my heart in this process. You draw me closer to you. God is with you. He sees you. He's not left you or forsaken you. He loves you. And he loves you deeply, whatever season you're in. So this morning, just say, God, I want to trust you. I want to trust you. I want to let you in. Why don't you bow your heads and let's pray together this morning. Jesus, we thank you for the work that you're doing in us. Lord, we thank you that even when we don't see it, you are moving, that you are good. Lord, I pray that you would prepare our hearts for everything that you're trying to do in our lives, big or small, that we would let go of the things that we need to let go of, that we would let go of bitterness or anger and the frustrations of the situations that we've been living in. Lord, I pray that you would draw our hearts closer to you, and in the moments that we're feeling the most defeated, that we would run to you and say, Abba, Father, I just need you. Lord, in the moments that we don't trust you, I pray that you would begin to shift our heart in that moment too, and you would help us to trust you. Lord, help us remember the situations where you've come through for us. Help us to remember your faithfulness. Help us to remember your goodness. Lord, help us to remember who you are and the promises that you've given us. Lord, help us to continue to pursue you boldly and to not let go of our dreams, to be courageous in the situations that are difficult, and to lean on you always. Jesus, with each day, just help us draw closer and closer to you. In your name, amen. Amen. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope that you're encouraged. I hope that you're challenged. We love you guys, and we'll see you back here next week.